Welcome to Critical Culture. Today we are talking about the role of public media in the United States. This episode was prompted by the rescission of funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. While we will cover some of the background information, the goal isn't a history lesson or an analysis of the rescission and its likely effects. The goal of the episode is to give just enough of that so that I can lay out some fresh topics of discussion. Discussion not about restoring what we're about to lose in form, rather discussion about how to build a new structure to meet the same needs in our new technology landscape. But first, a little history. For me, the story began in the summer of 1993. It was my first full-time job out of high school. I was doing flooring stuff, delivering furniture. I spent a lot of time in the country in Waupaca County. Not a lot of radio stations around back then. I had a Discman, but it used batteries. It wasn't a great situation. So I got to know the radio stations that were available in the area. And quickly, two of my favorites became NPR stations. One playing classical music, which was a marked departure from the heavy metal and rock that I was used to listening to. Kind of liked it. I don't know that I would have been exposed to it had it not been for that station. And the other one was more talk radio, with shows that covered the news and other educational topics that were produced in the state. So a lot of local things. So that was the start of my love affair with public media and experiencing culture through that. And it was the start of a long-term love affair, and now I could go on for hours about everything that I've consumed that came about because of the CPB, PBS, and NPR, from special series like Sesame Street, Nova, and Frontline. Two of the three I still record on my DVR today. I'll let you guess which two of those three. Two special events like The Power of Myth, which I didn't watch live on PBS in the 80s, but it turned into a book that was foundational in my 20s, and I have since listened to and watched much of that through YouTube. The original Cosmos series with Carl Sagan, which was one of the most, in fact, was the most watched PBS special for decades until the 1990s when Civil War overtook Cosmos for that honor. Then moving on to the NPR side, tons of news. Great news, as unbiased as it gets in our news culture today. Shows like This American Life, Radiolab, Wait, Don't Tell Me, A Prairie Home Companion, Moth Radio Hour, to the best of our knowledge. The list is endless, and now these shows turned into podcasts, and more podcasts have stemmed up from NPR's labs like Life Kit, Pop Culture Happy Hour, financial ones. I mean, again, I could go on for a half hour, just tons of great programming. This is very educational and entertaining that probably wouldn't have earned the ability to get the kind of distribution it got without the support of NPR. So that's my story. That's why I love PBS and NPR. For the United States, the story began on May 7th, 1964. And on that day, Lyndon Johnson first used the phrase, the Great Society, in a speech he gave at Ohio University. So it turns out the Great Society was one of the greatest periods of liberal reform in United States history. Obviously, the first was the Progressive Era, the beginning of the 20th century, a response to the problems of the Gilded Age. Then there was FDR's New Deal, which was a response to the Great Depression. If you want an enlightening, uplifting vision of the type of society and the type of change we can build after our current regression, I highly recommend reading more about these three periods. So the Great Society was a little different. Itself, it was a response to a period of rapid economic growth. And along with that growth came a turning point in the media. By 1960, the percentage of households with a television had skyrocketed from 9% to 87%. Emotional coverage of events like JFK's assassination, the Vietnam War, and the civil rights movements elevated our collective consciousness about the reality of the problems we faced as a nation. The Great Society sought to build on the legacy of former President FDR's New Deal reforms of the 1930s and planned to use the power of the federal government in order to address economic inequality, improve education and healthcare, and promote civil rights. These are fundamental goals of society that will not entirely be addressed by profit motive. There is so much we could cover from the process of how the reforms were incubated and implemented, but to rein us back, let's zoom in on 1967. On January 26th of 1967, a landmark report, Public Television, a Program for Action, was published. Now, this came about because of the first national conference on long-range financing of educational television stations. Coming out for that was a call for a study on the role of non-commercial education television in society. And the Carnegie Corporation picked that up and agreed to finance the work of this commission, resulting in this report. This report popularized the phrase public television and assisted the legislative campaign for federal aid. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, enacted less than 10 months later, chartered the Corporation for Public Broadcasting as a private, nonprofit corporation. So this initiated federal aid through the CPB for the operation of public broadcasting. The operation, not necessarily the capital facilities. So the CPB initially collaborated with the pre-existing national education television system. In 1969, they decided to start the PBS, or Public Broadcasting Service. A public radio study commissioned by the CPB and the Ford Foundation led to the establishment of National Public Radio, a public radio system under the terms of the amended Public Broadcasting Act. Now, this passed through Congress and was initially bipartisan, but it didn't stay that way for long. Richard Nixon was the first presidential opponent of public broadcasting. Early on, his administration was somewhat supportive, wondering how they could make this work in their favor, wondering how this would be financed, whether it was going to come from general tax funding, if there was going to be a special tax. For example, they considered a special tax on radio and television equipment that would go to fund this. Didn't end up happening. But initially, they weren't entirely opposed to it. There were some things they didn't like. One of them, his administration disliked the idea for Ford Foundation-supported programs. There's this concept of he who pays the piper calls the tune, and they didn't like that. Even though there was little indication that the Ford Foundation had or wanted much influence over program selection. And from the standpoint of Nixon's objectives, the grants to individual stations cut both ways. The people who run the educational and public television stations around the country tended to be relatively liberal, much as they are today. But the geographical diversification probably would promote an overall less liberal emphasis than New York City and West Coast centralized public media. It was also their position at the beginning very strongly that government funding of the CPB should not be used for the creation of anti-administration programming or for the support of program-producing organizations which use other funds to create anti-administration programs. And this is where I start to have a bigger problem with their stance here. Because as Americans, we want free speech. We are not beholden to an administration. We're beholden to the nation and our common ideals and our common values. The moment we forget that and we start to be opposed to anything that could be against an administration, we start to walk away from our democratic ideals. In short, Nixon was a crook, and he wanted to control the media, and if he couldn't, he wasn't in favor of it. And while Nixon couldn't kill CPB, he wasn't the last president to try. Ronald Reagan was also not a fan of public media and attempted to defund it. A lot of the pushback, even from within the Republican Party, came from the role that NPR and PBS stations play in rural areas that are relative news deserts that use this funding to keep their stations alive, to produce local news and do coverage of local emergencies and disasters, and to get the good word out about what's happening in these cases out to their members. Trump in his first administration pushed for this, and in his second administration finally succeeded. And here's what I'm not going to cover. I'm not going to cover what the CPB is or does, or PBS or NPR. I'm not going to cover how it's run or how it's funded. All that information is available on their sites. It's a good read if you're interested. It's very informative. I'm not going to cover what just happened in terms of how that money got clawed back, and I'm not going to cover what is going to happen because of that. There's plenty of coverage out there. We are going to go next to the three main arguments against public media. One of the primary arguments is it is not part of our nation's charter, and people just don't want to pay to distribute ideas that they don't believe in. And the argument against that is an educated populace is just as important as a strong military in defending our nation. Period. Point blank. Refer to the founding fathers. Almost all of them have quoted about free press and an educated populace being required to maintain a functioning democracy in a strong nation. This is absolutely part of our nation's charter, and it should be. We need it precisely because it was built to be able to produce the kind of content whose primary purpose isn't to manipulate human psychology, to sell products, or push an ideology driven entirely by privately funded interests. I'm not saying all of that is bad or wrong, but we definitely need a counterbalance to that for society to flourish. We need it because we need the ability to have publicly funded, quote unquote, anti-administration content, the kind of stuff that the Nixon administration was afraid of. That is definitely a part of America is free speech. And we need content that will question our government and inform people to make sure that the people that we elect aren't doing bad things in our name, with our money, with our agency. Specifically to the people that say they don't believe in it, they don't want to fund it, they shouldn't have to. I can point to millions of Americans who don't believe in all of the missions that our military is instructed to go on and would love to not be able to fund those, but it's not an individual case by case, this is what I fund, this is what I don't want to fund. This is something that we elect people to help decide for us that have more information than us, that help make sure that we've got a robust defense, that we've got robust education out there, whether we believe in all of the missions of our military or all of the educational content or cultural content that's put out there by public media. People against public media talk about the marketplace for ideas. And if there really is a need for this type of content, the marketplace will take care of that. And there's two components to that. One is the Medicaid argument. Medicaid serves a large number of people with very costly diseases and conditions that the private insurance market just will not take care of. The market does not take care of all needs that should be taken care of by society. The market takes care of needs where a profit can be made. And that's it. So to think that the marketplace will take care of all of these needs is just false. And to think, oh, we can just rely on the charity of some rich people to take care of these needs, that is also wrong. The other argument against the marketplace for the ideas is the Learning Channel. The Learning Channel's history is rooted in educational programming. It was launched in 1972 as part of the Appalachian Community Service Network, funded by NASA and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. In the early years, it was aimed at delivering educational content. It saw shows like Paleo World, An Amazing Space, and this was about documentaries. This is about science, history, nature, and other informative topics that serve the public good. When it was acquired by the owners of the Discovery Channel, it began to transition towards reality television. Instead of a place for learning minds and life unscripted, and then life surprises. Today, it's known for a diverse range of reality TV shows, including 19 Kids and Counting, and Honey Boo Boo, and Hoarding, Buried Alive. Now, this is what happens when the marketplace takes care of something that was originally designed to be a learning channel. And I think we would see the same thing if we left PBS and NPR entirely up to commercial interests. And the final point that I hear often from people against public media is it's just too liberal. So this is a fear of competing in a marketplace of ideas, and these people need to just get over it. If you need to silence opposing voices to win hearts and minds in order to come out on top when the debate is judged, you don't have a valid argument. I don't like everything on every piece of media I see. I don't like everything my government does, but I can't pick and choose and squelch voices that disagree with me. And I don't think that's a way that a society should operate. And now on to what next. I think it's time to review the initial goals and time to commission a new study to revamp the concept of public media and its place in the United States. Anyone working on a Democratic Project 2029, this would be a great concept to visit. One of the initial goals was addressing economic inequality. So this is worse than it's ever been. And people are part of the answer, specifically well-educated people, people that understand how the modern economy works, the skills that people need to work in the modern economy, and to some extent, perhaps also helping to provide ways for people to earn income as part of public media in producing content. So content creators that serve the public good. It has a goal even in helping people understand economic inequality and how it got to be as bad as it is, how it was better in the past, and what we can do to address it as a society. So economic inequality is still an issue, still a great goal to address with public media. Improving education and healthcare kind of go hand in hand, right? Education is the gateway to a better future in a world changing faster than ever before. We have to focus more on continued education. Sesame Street for adults, but not with Big Bird, right? Maybe it's animated, maybe it's real people. That doesn't matter. But the point is continued education for everyone. Education is a concept that I'm big on, also big on continued education. Myself, I went on to school in my 40s. I try to learn all the time. So I've done informal and formal education. It's a big part of what public media should be about. We know more than ever before. The means to distribute information are greater than ever before. The challenge is there is so much information out there and so much of it really isn't useful. We need a way for good information to cut through the clutter and get to people. And the healthcare side of that, I'm a firm believer in taking care of yourself and knowing how to take care of yourself and being encouraged to do it and constantly working on that aspect is a big part of healthcare. That's the proactive part. Obviously, people have conditions that need medical professionals to address. Obviously, there is still the medical side to that, but education is a huge part of healthcare. And we can't ignore the positive impact we could have on America's ailing healthcare system simply by more good education about healthcare that isn't tied to a magic pill or somebody's financial interests to try and get you to spend money thinking you have to spend money to have better health. We also have the goal of promoting civil rights. Civil rights is something we all have to various degrees. We all don't have equal opportunity to exercise our civil rights, and we all need to work together to protect the civil rights of everyone. That's the only way we maintain them. Even if you have yours now, you may not have them forever. And educating people and promoting the cause of civil rights is a public good. This isn't about class, color, gender, or sexual orientation. Those are just categories of people that have traditionally and frequently had their civil rights denied. So people automatically think about them when they think of civil rights. But civil rights is a positive, pro-social good we all have. It just happens to be the focus tends to go towards people who have had their rights denied when we talk about promoting civil rights. And I'll add a few of the following to the discussion. Serving as a watchdog to government. So this, again, is something that the Nixon administration wasn't fond of. They didn't like anti-administration content. I am pro-anti-administration content when the administration is not for the public good of the United States and the people of the United States. And this is especially crucial at the local level where the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and its member organizations are often the only news source at the local level in half of America, especially rural America. Areas without local news suffer more from political corruption than places with local news coverage. Democracy dies in darkness, indeed. This is definitely a core part of what I believe the charter should be for public media. And the other one I'll throw in there is serving information needs of communities in times of crisis or communities whose needs are underserved. So this speaks to the types of situations where there's wildfires in Texas and public radio is the only way many people get information about fast-moving storms and problems. Likewise, in times of flooding and whatnot, if you have a situation where even cell phone towers are down because of a local emergency, radio is the only way to get information out. There's places in Alaska where they just don't have that type of communication, that they've got cell towers and internet options. And public radio is how people understand what's going on with the river as it's thawing and other local needs that really do need to be served by public media, promoting distribution and production of this content where there's just not enough financial benefit there for a corporation that wants to earn money to go in and provide this service and be able to make money off of it. That is definitely something that is in the public good. So now let's talk about two different perspectives to consider here. Distribution and production. And in my perspective, consumption of this all is also a part of distribution. It's two parts of the same whole there. So consumption has shifted over time from oral tradition to written to radio and onto TV and now the internet, which is a mix of all the previous formats. So this consumption and distribution paradigm, we need some redundancy. So this means that, yes, we can rely on cell phone networks across much of the United States today, but there could be problems with that. We can rely on satellites, but some government could cause problems and destroy satellites in space, whether it's a nuclear weapon in space that would destroy satellites, whether it's just debris, whatever the problem is, we need some level of redundancy. So just scrapping radio in areas isn't really a plan. I think this is a case where we really need to consider having the ability to consume radio broadcasts on our devices just as readily as we can consume data from our cell phone towers. I don't remember the specifics, but I believe it wouldn't be that terribly difficult to put in AM, FM type receivers into cell phones. And then we've got some redundancy here. So just saying this is the modern age, we can do just with internet, I don't think that really flies. I think we still need some level of backup in radio. And I also believe more perhaps subsidized distribution where we've got more cell coverage in some of these areas that aren't covered today. So there's redundancy there too. So it's not just radio. So it's a two-way communication mechanism everywhere that we have. I think other things to consider here, distribution and production of this content is increasingly decoupled. In a lot of the public media, you have the money going to stations that are producing content or the parent organization producing content that's distributed by stations. Now it's increasingly decoupled. These things can be produced and distributed without radio or without television. An important aspect of that is now both can introduce bias, and both can ignore important gaps in human needs that we need to address, right? So this talks to something that I read in the book Nexus by Noah Yuval Harari, where we look at the platforms like Meta's platforms and social media platforms, and they say they're just like this public board and they're not producing, they're just distributing. But part of production of media is editorial, and the algorithms they have running now are definitely editorial. This has some level of production value where it can introduce bias. We need to support alternate mechanisms for this distribution and also play in that playground as well when it comes to advertising. I think this is another important part. It used to be that they looked at the broadcast spectrum that was leased to stations as the public resource that was in limited demand. Now that we've got digital distribution from that perspective isn't exactly in limited demand, right? It's not the broadcast frequency, it's attention. Attention is what is day traded. This is what is in critical demand. And advertising is a big part of how that attention is garnered. So I think this is another thing we need to consider in terms of how does this play into public media. I mean, yes, we still need the radio stations, still potential value in television stations broadcasting, but how do we talk about distribution of this content in a algorithm defined world of social media that dominates the internet? And, 10 years ago, it was search, it was Google, and they dominated the discoverability of things, and they got all the advertising money. And then social media took over, and social media dominated. So when we talk about trying to see how these concepts fit into distribution of public media, I don't think it's going after specific industries and trying to regulate or tax them. I think it's looking at advertising in general. Because you have to look at what's coming for the next platforms, whether it's artificial intelligence or virtual reality or whatever is coming next. Advertising is going to be a big part of that. And if we just chase search or if we chase social media, we're always going to be behind the next platforms. And I think advertising is really the concept that we have to consider here. Again, I don't have all the answers. I don't know what that looks like. I don't even think it's necessarily a regulation question in terms of regulating advertising, although we do already regulate advertising in terms of if it's medical claims. Specific words will trigger language that you can get in trouble if you don't have studies with the FDA proving that your drug does what it does. I wish we had something along those lines for political ads, but we don't. I understand how it is trickier to go after because political speech needs to be free. However, political speech can be, if not squelched, it can be labeled as this is an unscientific claim or this goes counter to what the facts are in a case. And I don't, even back to the concept of public media, it's not necessarily that I'm asking for limiting what can be done during advertising, but maybe we look at specifically how we tax advertising. And I'm not talking about removing it as a business expense that is deductible for businesses. I don't think that's a good idea. Advertising is a function of humanity. It works with human psychology. It's part of how we get ideas out to the public. It is a tool. It is not good or bad. It is just used for different purposes that could end up being looked at as good or bad depending on the outcomes and intent behind those purposes. What I am talking about is specifically tax on advertising, which I believe Maryland has done, and other states and localities have looked at a tax on advertising. But what if part of this is a tax on advertising revenue in general? And what if we had this in place when Google was coming up, and maybe a little bit of their money would have gone towards public media, directly funding that. And some of that, in fact, would go towards content creators that were working on content that wasn't commercially viable. Some of that would come back into the advertising system. Maybe that content is there and it's paid for. And it's also a matter of, again, the distribution, not being the public radio station or the public television station. Maybe it's, hey, we funded this content. Now we're also going to fund some advertising for that. So that money comes back into these systems that have dominated the internet for the last decade, whether it's search or social media. And it becomes like this flywheel that helps keep that money flowing through the system and ensure that some of this money goes towards things that are for a public good, a common good for all of us that is positive for society, that isn't tied to a commercially viable project that somebody can make a fortune off of. So there's a lot more we could dig into on like what type of education we would want to promote, how some of these different perspectives of building public media could work, but I'm going to leave that here for today. I think my call to action is to remember that a new progressive era is coming, and we would do well to spend more time studying the previous American comebacks for progressive policy. We need to understand how the momentum for them formed, how the technology and the culture of the times shaped the possibilities, and how people made them happen. Our time is coming. Thanks for listening.